Hey, so in this video, I'm going to talk about different methods I've heard about and tried for building your ear training skills, and talk about how I currently approach ear training for myself. The idea for the video came from a viewer who asked what I would recommend for self-teaching ear training type stuff. I'll probably be doing more practical ear training related videos down the road as well. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm just going to talk about two different approaches that I've kind of identified for myself. I'll call the first one the chaos approach, which is a very good approach that works. The second approach, I'll just call it the structured approach, which is kind of basically how I approach things. A little more steps to it. So first off, for the chaos approach, basically in a nutshell, this approach would include daily, or let's say 5 times a week, 4 times a week, something like that, spending 10 to 15 minutes just doing hunt and peck for a melody. Hunt and peck meaning you sit down, you play a note. Okay, well, if that's note 1, what's the next note? And you just kind of feel around for the next note. So you would do that for a melody, just for the tune of the song, based on either songs that you know, so they're in your memory, they're in your head, or by playing along with the recording of a song from YouTube or something like that. One thing that can help is to keep a record of songs that you've tried and kind of put a note to yourself about how hard it was, how far you got into it. Because a lot of songs in the beginning, most songs in the beginning, you're not going to be able to get very far in without really giving yourself a headache. But then, and you could also choose to revisit the same song more than once. Let's say you have a favorite song and you just want to kind of work through it bit by bit. You could definitely return to it, but the one thing you want to keep in mind is the practice effect of repeating the same song too much would eventually result in kind of memorizing the song rather than actually keeping on learning how to recognize the elements of it by ear. So you probably want to keep the repetition to a minimum in that sense. This approach works with whether you have past experience with music theory and or sight reading or not. Now, there are some basics of music theory that you do need beforehand. For example, the fact that the half step on the piano, the black note, or the distance between 2 white notes without a black note between them, or on the guitar fretboard, single fret, just knowing that that's there, knowing that scales exist and that they are combinations of certain amounts of half steps, and that scales are sounds, bunches of notes that sound right together, and the fact that there are different kinds of scales. So those are kind of some things you at least want to have in your head. If you know that, the fact that those things exist, then you can at least get started. You don't need to know a lot about theory to get started with hunt and peck, but you do need to at least have a sense that there are these kinds of categories and patterns that will emerge over time. Now, the reason I call it the chaos method, I guess it's a little derogatory. It just doesn't imply that it doesn't work. It's just why I personally didn't find that it worked for me long term, is because it's very hard to regulate your progress, to know where you are in your progress. It's very hard to find material that's appropriate to your skill level. If you play your favorite song and it's some kind of, let's say, progressive rock or progressive metal, anything classical, any film score, it just a lot of stuff is just way up there, on the high peak. So it's pretty hard to find material that will, and also material that will build on the thing that you worked on yesterday and the day before, instead of, being unrelated, so that you don't get that spaced repetition, where you're reinforcing things you're learning. So because of stuff like that, how much you're going to improve in a given session can end up being kind of uncontrolled and unpredictable. And that's why for some of us, it just results in frustration when things are too difficult and they don't reinforce things that you've been working on the previous days. Now, one thing you could do to help tone down the chaos factor, it helps if you intentionally try to select, especially at first, select easy sounding songs. So if you're a musician, you can sight read or you play by, chords and things like that, then you might be able to select songs that stay in a single key. Preferably at first, you probably want to be in the key of C because that's the simplest, depending on different things. Something that uses standard scales, such as major or pentatonic. So not something that's changing keys all the time or using some of these weird scales. And something with melodies that include mostly small intervals. For example, probably want to stay less than a sixth for a good while. At least generally speaking, there might be a couple large leaps, but generally speaking, we're dealing with smaller intervals for most of the melody. Now, if you're a complete beginner and that doesn't mean a lot to you, then just try to pick songs that sound basic to you. And sometimes people can kind of just have a sense of that. And one easy place to go is if you get folk songs or children's songs, they tend to work well. Of course, they don't sound very exciting. but they tend to be a little on the simpler side in terms of that kind of thing. And once again, this is why I call it the chaos method, because you can't take yourself too seriously or work too hard at it, or you may find frustration when things are too difficult or literally impossible. I mean, you get a piece from your favorite band and it's literally impossible for you at this point. So you could work at it a little bit, get a little frustrated, and then stop and do something else, that kind of thing. This approach, I first heard about it when listening to a classically trained pianist talk about his journey toward ear training. He explained that he went through university and he was never taught to play by ear. He wasn't ever really taught about playing by ear. And he always thought or got the impression that playing by ear was a gift that you either had or you didn't have. And then once he found out this was true, this is the approach that he said he used and he recommended for other people. Basically just 15 minutes a day over a long period of time. And he says for him, as a classically trained pianist who could play anything by sight, but couldn't do anything by ear, that was all it took for him over a long period of time to learn to play entirely by ear. So needless to say, this approach works. However, some of the drawbacks, like I said, it's difficult to track your progress. It can lead to frustration, especially if you're a beginner. And for myself, I prefer the structured approach, which I'm going to deal with in a minute. But it's important to remember, if you don't find the chaos aspect frustrating, if you can be consistent with this approach over the long haul, and you can put in the 15 minutes and don't take yourself too seriously, don't get too frustrated, and just put in your time and come back next day. You know, have some kind of plan for what kind of songs you want to do and for how far you want to go before you give up, because you're going to have to do a lot of giving up with this approach, which is okay, because succeeding is not mastering the song. Succeeding is putting in the time to sharpen your skills. If you can do that, this approach can really get you where you want to go. One of the benefits about it is, even though it's chaotic, it's simple. So if you can put away the 15 minutes and you don't want to worry about all the complexities of the structured approach I'm going to talk about, the chaos approach works. You can definitely use it. All right, structured approach. Depending on how long this video is, I might cut it up into parts, I'm not sure. But the structured approach is, and this is my term, I made up the term chaos and structured. It's just two different things that I've noticed. So this is basically how I do things to take the randomness out of the chaos approach. This approach consists of three main parts, the way I look at it. First part, formal interval recognition, which you can do with a friend or with an app or a variety of apps. Part two is hunt and peck, like what I said in the chaos approach. Basically the same thing, but I put it here as just do it once in a while, don't take it too seriously. And then the third part, which is where it really gets systematic, is systematically using educational music for play along and transcription. So part one of my structured approach, interval recognition, this is really the foundation. And even if you're taking the chaos approach, put in some of this foundation, you'll make it easier for yourself. Because having interval recognition makes your hunt and peck time much more enjoyable, much easier, and it's indispensable for what I'm going to call part three here. The goal is not to conquer interval recognition entirely before you move on. The goal instead is to get the most basic parts of interval recognition down, and then to keep on working on this in the background while you move on to phases 2 and 3. And then at this point, you can start doing some random hunt and peck whenever you feel like it. Just keep in mind, it might be frustrating, it might not be very productive, but just do it for fun. Don't take it very seriously if you do it. Instead, just instead of focusing on taking the hunt and peck part really seriously, instead of that, start by using some apps or a practice buddy. There's a lot of great apps for interval recognition. And start learning to recognize the most important intervals. So some good ones to start with that you really want to have down before you start taking anything else too seriously. You want to have your major second, your perfect fourth, your perfect fifth. And really getting the minor second is great, just because if you get that firmly in your head, then you can figure out a lot of the other ones and stuff like that. Once you get those basic ones down, you can just start with phases 2 and 3. And then as you go forward with those, keep on putting some time and effort into your interval recognition, which you really want to put in some focus on until you're at the point where you've got the major and minor second, major and minor third, all the perfect intervals. Perfect intervals include the fourth, fifth of the octave. Once you got all those important ones down, then you can really focus on phases 2 and 3, because those are the building blocks for a lot of music. One thing that helps with interval recognition, a lot of people find it helps to have a song or some kind of audible exercise in your head that reminds you of the interval. For example, if you're trying to remember the perfect fifth, it helps to think in your mind, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Bum, 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 bum. So if you hear, you're using your app and it goes bum, bum, and you think to yourself, that sounds like Twinkle, Twinkle. You say, well, let's see if it's a fifth, and you check it, and you may be right, It's also helpful, but not necessary, to develop the skill of singing intervals, even if you don't have any intention of being a singer. It's kind of like if you're learning how to read, somebody might say, well, it's going to help if you learn how to write at the same time, because it's going to have a little bit of a reinforcing effect. But it's not necessary. And if you never are going to use that other skill, you don't need to develop it, but it is helpful. So for myself, in terms of having an audible thing in my head, what I tend to do for a major second, I envision in my head a major scale. Da, 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 da. So if I hear da, 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 I think, well, that sounds like a major scale, and that tips me off. For the major and minor triads, or for the major and minor thirds, I think of a major and minor triad. When I hear a fourth, I think of the traditional wedding march. Dum, ba, da, da, or if it's faster, it might trigger in my head some versions of Amazing Grace. Ba-da. For the fifth, I tend to think of the Klingon theme from Star Trek, ba-dum, ba-dum, or however it goes. Anyway, you can also use Twinkle Twinkle for that one. But for the major six, I try to think of the folk song, My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, which usually helps. For the minor six, I actually don't have anything reliable in my head, which is part of why the minor six is kind of hard for me still. But the key to that, and the point behind all of that, I just gave you a little bit into my head and what pops in my head when I try to trigger myself for what the interval is. The key is finding out what that given interval reminds you of most, so that you can keep it in your head to remind you. It's kind of like if you're trying to memorize the main points in a speech or the things for your test in grade school. It's kind of like a mnemonic device for that. You might say, oh, well, it's number 2. Well, that reminds me of, an animal with horns, and it's got 2 horns, whatever. Having that image in your head is kind of similar to that. It's a shortcut that you could use for down the road, getting it drilled into the instinctive part of your mind. So the most thorough approach would be to develop your ability to recognize the interval, as well as your ability to sing the interval. But if you want to cut corners, and if you don't ever plan to write music or to sight sing anything, probably skip the second part. Down the road, as you get more advanced, you'll eventually expand this part, this phase 1 of my 3 parts. You'll eventually expand it to some other parts while you're focusing on phases 2 and 3. So you'll expand it to learning the rest of the intervals up to an octave, beginning work on some harmony recognition, and recognizing kinds of chords like major, minor, seventh, things like that. And then eventually the highest point would be harmonic dictation, where you hear a chord and then you basically write out without touching your instrument. You write out what inversion it is, how many notes there are, what the notes are, that kind of thing. But that's, for someone like myself, that's, over the rainbow. I'm not getting there anytime soon. And that would all be within the phase 1 part here, group lumped in with interval recognition. Needless to say, it's a journey that doesn't ever end for most of us. Phase 2 is the hunt and peck method, like I said, for the chaos method above. But in the structured approach for myself, the way I would view it is just do it for fun whenever you feel like it. And if you don't enjoy it anymore, then quit, come back later. Don't take it too seriously. Phase 3, in my approach here, this would be the thing that you want to begin just as soon as you got the most basic intervals down. Like if you've got, minor second all the way up to a perfect fifth, you're probably ready to jump into phase 3. And here's how I would approach it. I would start by finding material that you're going to know will be predictably classified according to some skill level. So what I would recommend is finding some audio that goes along with a beginner's sight reading method book that you know you've never played before. So you find a method book that's beginner level, find some audio of recordings of people playing the songs. That's a great place to start. So sometimes those audio recordings come with the books. If you buy it and it has an audio package, audio online, or maybe it has a CD. Other times you can find those kinds of recordings on YouTube or on the official website. If you do find the audio for free online, I personally recommend purchasing the book, even if you don't need it. Purchase the book just as a way to support the skilled professionals who developed the materials, because otherwise you're basically using someone's product without compensating them for it. So start in the primer book and just listen to the recording and use very much the same mindset as the hunt and peck approach, except the difference is you're going to be playing very basic music. And once you find the first note, you're going to have a general idea what ballpark you're in for the rest of the song. And I would recommend just trying to play it without looking at the sheet music. And when you can't find the note, pause the recording, try to find it, and then resume the recording. Now, one thing that I found hard at first when I started with this approach was just finding the first note. That was a bit, that was the one part that was a steep learning curve. And you could actually make that easier for yourself if you just want to glance at the sheet music just to see the first note. Once you see the first note, look away, put away the sheet music. That can be helpful. It's your call whether you want to do that to make it easier, or if you want to do what I did, which is basically just don't even touch the sheet music. I personally found it more compelling to never look at the sheet music, but it probably slowed me down a good bit. And definitely, as you go further along, you're going to want to develop the ability to find the first note without any help. Once you finish the primer level book and you've begun working through book 1, at some point you're going to want to start transcribing. So why do I suggest that? Why do I recommend that? What's the point of transcribing if your goal is to develop your ear? Because your ear doesn't include your pencil, So here's 5 reasons that I started transcribing and I recommend it. Number 1, as you get more advanced, songs have more notes, and so it becomes much less satisfying to just grope your way around with songs you've never heard before. So you play the note, and then at the end, you don't have a song, you just have a bunch of notes you played, while pausing the thing here and there. Reason number 2, transcribing allows you to see the song visually, which helps you begin to develop the skill of figuring out the structure of a song on your own, which is very helpful. Because in real life, when you find a song, you aren't just playing a couple notes of it at a time, you're playing a song. So you want to be able to visualize the structure of the song. Reason number 3, transcribing allows you afterwards, once you're done with it, allows you to play the whole song yourself in its entirety, which then proves that you have learned the song and not just a collection of meaningless intervals. Reason 4, transcribing gives you something to show for your work. It's kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle or solving the crossword puzzle. It's far less fun if once you find something, the whole puzzle just reverts back to the chaos. Like you put 2 pieces together and aha, I found them. And then, you move on and those 2 pieces aren't connected anymore. Kind of like that. When you actually write it all down, you have something to show for yourself when you're done. And then reason number 5, transcribing gives you the opportunity to recognize elements that if you were just doing hunt and peck alone, you might miss. Things like rhythmic elements, repetitions, and parallel types things in the structure of it, the combination of easy and difficult elements in the same song. My experience before I began transcribing was that I would find some parts of the song to be annoyingly easy and other parts to be annoyingly hard. But once I started transcribing, those easy parts were fun because they're so easy. The difficult parts were pleasantly challenging because they were so hard. And the reason was because once I got it written down, I had something to show for my time and effort, and I could play back the whole song as a whole. So how do you transcribe? For myself, I use two phases. This is just my personal approach. First thing I do is I write it down quickly on paper, or I could do it on my phone or something. Only the melody. Next step is I add rhythm and harmony. Third step is I transfer it onto my computer using a music notation tool such as MuseScore. So I'll go ahead and describe all the steps for my own approach, but the point and what really matters for ear training for yourself is that you write down something that you understand and that you can play back afterwards. So my personal approach, I'll use kind of a simplified shorthand for my initial quick draft. I find it much quicker and more convenient than trying to use notation software in the first step. And I can do it no matter where I'm at, because I can either write it on a sheet of paper or I can use the notepad on my phone because I can just use text for it. So what I do is I indicate notes based on their letter name, and I have a system I use to indicate what relative octave that note is in. I then, for the rhythm stage, I add numbers to indicate rhythmic durations, and then I leave notes without numbers when I intend them to be eighth notes. And then for harmony, depending on what I want to do, I'll either put a chord name inside a circle to distinguish it from letters that don't mean chords, or I'll just have a stack of letters to indicate all the actual notes in the chord. So in the end, I have something on paper that contains all the information necessary, so I can open up MuseScore and there's no, I don't have to figure anything else out. I just transfer it over, because I have all the elements indicated in my own little language there. Next step for me, plug in my computer, spit out the song in proper notation. And the cool thing about putting it into proper notation, if you have a good tool like MuseScore, is that once you got it down, you can hit the play button and it'll play it for you in robot style, but you can actually make sure all the rhythms are correct. Now, depending on the song, I might skip the last step, but I recommend it for complete beginners as a good exercise to get used to using music notation software if that's something you would eventually want to be doing. And it's also helpful to put it into proper notation just so you can see it on the page, strengthen that connection between your sight reading brain and your ear training brain. And then, of course, not to mention being able to hear it played back by the computer. So to summarize, the structured approach that I use includes three elements. One, consistent use of ear training exercises for interval recognition, and then later on for harmony recognition, which is going to lay the foundation for phases 2 and 3, but you should keep doing it, once you start phases 2 and 3. Stage 2, hunt and peck at will when you feel like it, for fun, not as an obligation or as an exercise. Stage 3, consistent progression. So you start this when you start phase 2. Phase 2 is not a phase, it's just something you do. None of these are phases, really. They're just parts. But phase 3 is consistent progression through a curriculum, quote unquote. Basically progression through collections of audio that actually progress from really beginner to more advanced stuff, transcribing it and then playing it back. The reason I like the 3-phase approach is because it's systematic. It doesn't overload you with tasks. So to get your head around it, yeah, it's a lot more complicated than the chaos approach. But once you get your head around it, what you do in a given day is going to be a lot more straightforward, a lot simpler, a lot less of a headache, because you'll be doing things that are at your skill level. And everything you do, you're going to have something to show for your work. So that's how I approach music notation, that's how I approach ear training. And that's what I do now. I'm not as consistent as I would like to be. But even with being not as consistent as I think I should be, I still see results. And I come to some days when I sit down and do the hunt and peck approach, and I can almost play the song. Usually, when at the level that I'm at, whether you call that beginner or whatever you want to call the level I'm at, I can sit down and play a melody pretty much. Like I'll make mistakes, but I'll get most of the melody. And then once I've got that down, a couple tries and I have that down, and then I'll start putting in the harmony, which I'll usually do based on, I'll figure out the chord and then I'll do the chord however I want. And then if it's a song I really like, I might put it down on paper, or I might put it on a lead sheet. A couple days ago, I played a computer game I hadn't played since, maybe like 6 years ago or something, and it had this really recognizable theme. And sat down on my piano in a spare minute, and I kind of plunked out the melody, and I thought it's got some simple harmonies, so I got the harmonies, and then I actually skipped the writing it down stage, and I just pulled up my computer because it was simple enough. I knew the rhythms enough, and so I put it in a lead sheet, and then I added, just for the fun of it, I made an arrangement where it went different, starts in the middle octave, goes higher, goes lower, and then the left hand accompaniment is kind of changing in what kind of pattern it's doing. So that was just kind of fun, and that's an example of what you can get down the road when you get these skills and they're more comfortable. In the beginning, it's just a pain. Like, no matter what approach you use, it's a bit of a pain, and you don't get that payoff. And what you don't want to do, in my opinion, is take your favorite song and spend 3 hours trying to figure it out. I've talked to people who did that. It doesn't sound like they had a lot of fun, and doesn't sound like it was a really rewarding experience because it was so stinking hard. And then in the end, oh, I can play my favorite song, but that's all you can play, and you hate it. For myself, if I listen to that song and try to play that song that many times, I'm actually going to hate the song, but I'm especially going to hate trying to play things by ear. This approach, you may be playing Mary Had a Little Lamb in the beginning, but that's not so bad. You're learning intervals, you're learning how to hear things, and over time you can play your favorite song without making a headache out of it. So that's kind of why I like this approach and stuff like that. Hope this is helpful, and like I said, I'm probably going to make some more videos talking about just practical, down-to-earth, how to do ear training, how to make it more fun, that kind of thing.